Oh, hello, and welcome to Dark Passages. Dark Passages is a weekly podcast presented by me, Chris Stone, reading stories I've written over the past 15 years or so. The Afflicted, Episode 2. In the near distance pre-med students, these volunteer nurses, they suck blood from the unfortunates by the arm and bagful. Giant pumping machines were stealing their platelets, their electrolytes, draining them, leaving them hollow. All the while, these nurses, they were changing bags, wheeling carts stacked waist high with sacks engorged with blood to a giant refrigerator and back. They were pricking skin with needles, inserting tubes the size of vacuum hoses into arteries, greedily taking whatever they wanted from the unconscious patients. These sadists, they were doing this with that painted on smile, that fake goddamn grin, that cartoon sized red painted half moon of teeth. These volunteers with their giant red smiles and face full of teeth, they hustled almost giddily around the room, never colliding with one another, just tiny, efficient clogs in this giant, blood-sucking machine. These fake nurses in their sale rack lab coats and off-white clearance sale tennis shoes. These smiling frauds, these vampires. Oh, how they enjoyed their work. Sitting on the itchy couch, Keith took another bite of the chocolate chip cookie. He could taste every flavor, the chocolate, the grainy, unblended sugar, even the vanilla extract. His senses were returning. With his peanut butter brain leaving, he decided to again focus his returning recollective abilities on the coffee cup that his wife had been drinking from earlier that morning. Sunnier Days Retirement Home. The foggy haze cleared little by little. The treatment had opened the lockbox, and memories were being exposed. It turned out she wasn't so different from the volunteer blood drainers, was she? Hadn't she used to come home wearing blood-stained sneakers, telling horror stories, scrubbing blood from her knuckles in the kitchen sink with a bar of lava soap? The hard one with the pumice in it, the soap that could clean any grime from any knuckle? Hadn't she been a nurse? No, wait, his brain countered. Not a nurse, a volunteer. And suddenly, everything came rushing back to him all at once. The once impossible to remember nuggets of information came flooding out of his breached dam of memory. She had been a volunteer at Sunnier Days Retirement Home. She'd been a tiny cog in a different giant life-sucking machine. Fluffing pillows, changing bedpans, tuning televisions to The Price is Right in the morning and The Wheel of Fortune in the afternoon for smiling, drooling idiots that were just sitting on uncomfortable chairs, waiting to die. She'd done all of these things to help these decrepit, forgotten people, filed neatly away, shelved like old library books, by the very family members they used to love. She'd done everything she could to make their end just a bit more bearable, their impending deaths just a bit more manageable. He used to wonder if spending most of her waking hours with the dying had worn on her, prematurely aged her. But what could he have done about it? That was her deal, just as the stock game had been his. So who was he to question it? When she'd finally retired, if you could even retire from being a volunteer, she instead took up birdwatching, focusing on the free and living, no doubt, instead of the shriveled and dying. All of this, his still, slightly dizzied head remembered. And what about the earrings, and how had he met her in the first place? The memories didn't all come back immediately. That just wasn't how the treatments worked. But they did work, and he would remember. Make no doubts about that. He stared at the cookie and marveled at how it resembled some sort of space rock. No, a meteor. That's what they called them, right? Wait, no. If it had entered the atmosphere, then it became a meteorite, right? Isn't that what Miss Johnson had taught him in 7th grade? It felt right. Just like thinking of the cruise felt right. Miss Johnson, his favorite science teacher who had died no less than 30 years ago, her face was clear as day in his mind now. She was old back then, hell, probably as old as he is now. But isn't it funny how your perspective changes on that? She seemed impossibly old, gray, and withered, but her mind had still been sharp enough to teach middle schoolers science shit back then. And now, all these years later, sitting on that crunchy couch, he was jealous of her for that. Was losing your memory all a normal part of aging, part of the inevitable decline? Or did he have dementia? Or something worse? If his doctors had told him, he couldn't remember, at least not yet. It had all happened so gradually, little things he didn't really notice, like how that trick knee had become trickier, or like how he had forgotten his reading glasses were on top of his head and spent an hour and a half scouring the house for them. 1 gray hair had turned into 4, 4 into 8, and so on, until one day he just had a head full of them. It was just how things worked. Gradually at first, then boom, all at once you look in the mirror and you don't recognize yourself. So you see, he hadn't grown old all at once, and neither had his wife. But in some ways, that may have been easier. He could now clearly recall the time when he'd noticed her single white pubic hair and how it had disgusted him, and how he'd been unable to tell her. That fraud, that disgusting fraud, what right did it have to invade his wife's most personal area and set up shop there? It just didn't seem fair. It didn't seem right. Chomping on the chocolate chip cookie, he clearly remembered the stomach-turning sensation that had come with the sudden realization that his once beautiful young wife was now grandmother-aged. Moreover, that had been the moment when he had realized that he himself was no longer just getting old, but that he had already achieved that dubious distinction. He could strike "getting" from his vocabulary. The 20-year-old that used to cloud his mind with useful exploits of sex, with complex derivative calculations, with PE ratios, and corporate balance sheets, that mind that refused to decay, refused to age, it had finally gotten old. And sitting on the recovery couch, he now clearly remembered when things had first begun to break down. And he remembered the worst part of it had been knowing that it was happening, actually feeling it as it happened. He envied people that had simply hit their head and fallen into comas. At least they didn't have some infuriating sections of time when they knew exactly what was happening to them. Over the past 3 years, he'd felt his mind slipping like sand from loosely cupped hands. Memories faded like a Polaroid in reverse. At first, it was just short-term stuff that he couldn't remember, shit he could live without. But now he was beginning to forget things like goddamn earrings and where and under what circumstances he'd met his wife. Things that he'd spent his entire life committing to memory. Now these things were just slipping away. His mind was betraying him. It was as if aging was like rolling a ball down a hill. Sure, it goes slowly at first, but once momentum sets in, it's bye-bye Bali. They say it's hell to get old, and it's true. But he thought that maybe there was a little more to it than that. Moreover, not only was it hell getting old, but it was hell realizing that you were old. It was hell remembering how that reflection in the mirror used to look. It was hell seeing that new, strange, wrinkled, unrecognizable face. It was hell seeing his long-dead father staring at him from the depths of molten sand. It was hell realizing that he and his wife would soon take up residence at the very old folks' home where she'd already spent 21 years of her life. Yes, when he thought about it, there was something to be said for losing one's mind in a peaceful, idiotic delirium. But it needed to be all at once. The slow decline was simply unbearable. Some things were probably better not knowing, but those were the fucking breaks, weren't they? When you signed up for life, wasn't that part of what you were in for? Wasn't the inevitable decline part of the whole goddamn deal? He ate another bite of the chocolate chip cookie and banished the momentary thought. No, he wouldn't go out like that. Fuck peaceful idiocy. He'd made his decision, so here he was, getting his treatment and eating stale cookies on the itchiest goddamn couch that he'd ever sat on. Fading in and out of lucidity, he listened to the droning machines, the scurrying fake nurses, the random clicks and clacks of the doctor's dress shoes making their way from machine to machine. He'd seen all those things without looking because they were right there in front of him and probably always had been. As the world began to solidify, to make sense again, to lose its watery translucence, he gathered his nerves for a quick glance around the room. And there they were, just waiting for his visual confirmation. The rest of the donors, these nurses, these vampires, victims. He caught the bleary eyes of a pretty young blonde girl laying on a gurney not too far away from him and his deteriorating couch. Her dull gray eyes stared at him blankly, locking onto him with their idiot gaze. The blank eyes had been drained of color, drained of life. They startled him, and he suddenly remembered why he never looked at the donors. It was that fucking idiot gaze that he just couldn't take. A curl of dirty blonde hair creased her cheek and touched her lip, just above an idiot drool bubble. And he wanted to look away, but he couldn't. This was why he never looked. Her arm dangled over the side of the gurney with a tube affixed to her wrist, pumping the liquid the vampires called the clear into her veins. An electric cord connected her clamped finger to a buzzing EKG machine behind her. The monitor tracked the rise and fall of her vitals on a computer displayed seismograph. A cloth cap crammed full of blinking lights, cords, transistors, and microchips had been slapped on her head. Another monitor displayed whatever readings they were taking. A mechanical arm seized her throat and shoulders and arched her in this unnatural position with her chest arched high and her head canted to the side. The mechanical arm connected a series of tubes to a tiny collector bucket affixed to her bedside. He surmised the closest thing he could compare it to would be the ass end of a liposuction machine. The vacuum hose sucking all that bloody, fatty-looking material into the container. That's how the plastic surgeons on TV did it. But this was different. They weren't sucking her fat. No, they were taking something far more insidious. Whatever they were taking from her was leaving her gray and hollow with an idiot drool bubble on her lips. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and how she had found herself there, being a donor. This was why he never looked. If his old eyes hadn't failed him, the chart on the side of her gurney said that her name was Adrienne Carlson. Poor young Adrienne Carlson with her pale skin, idiot eyes, and hollowed cheeks of a dying woman. He couldn't help but wonder what her life had been like before she'd found this clinic. Had she been a struggling artist whoring herself for art supply money to create paintings that no one would buy? Or had she simply been a drug-addled runaway with perforated forearms and scabbed elbows? Hell, had she simply been a poet writing suicide notes that no one would read? While he couldn't know exactly who she had been, what he did know was that she had once been someone's daughter, someone's beloved, and now she was simply someone else's trash. She was a late-term abortion. This was why he never looked at the donors with their hollow skin and idiot eyes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Passages. Please join us next week as the story continues. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, share, and rate and review us on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please follow us on dark.passages.podcast on Instagram for additional information and episode release schedules. Original stories are all written by Chris Stone and are available on Amazon as ebooks. I'm Savannah, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.